Don't touch her. The words cut through the soft hum of conversation like glass shattering against marble, and in the next heartbeat, every fork froze midair, every whisper died on parted lips, and every pair of eyes turned toward the grand staircase where Ava Brooks stood, still clutching a silver tray that suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. She hadn't meant to be seen, hadn't meant to be anything more than invisible. Just another maid in a pressed black uniform moving quietly through a room filled with people who had never once looked at her as anything other than staff. But tonight something had shifted, because the man standing beside her wasn't just any man. He was Ethan Cole, the billionaire CEO, whose name was etched into the skyline, and whose presence alone could silence a room of the most powerful people in New York. Ava's breath caught as she felt the heat of attention crawl up her neck, the sting of judgment in the eyes around her sharper than any words, and for a split second, she considered stepping back, lowering her gaze, disappearing the way she always did, but then she heard it again, quieter this time, closer, meant only for her, stay. And before she could process what that meant, Ethan's hand wrapped around her wrist, firm but not rough, pulling her just slightly forward, enough to make it clear to everyone watching that she was no longer just staff passing through. She was standing beside him, with him, and the reaction was instant, a ripple of shock moving through the crowd. His fiancée, perfect, poised, dressed in a gown that probably cost more than Ava made in a year, stiffened visibly, her champagne glass trembling just enough to catch the light, and Ava felt her own heart slam against her ribs because this was wrong. All of it was wrong. She didn't belong here. Not like this, not in front of them, not in front of him. Ethan, what are you doing? The fiancé's voice broke through, controlled but sharp, and Ava flinched, instinctively trying to step back, but Ethan didn't let go. Instead, he turned, slow and deliberate, as if he had already made a decision long before this moment, and Ava caught a glimpse of something in his expression that didn't match the polished image she had seen from afar, something tense, something almost desperate. And then everything happened at once, because before she could pull away, before she could even speak, he leaned in and pressed his lips to hers, not lingering, not forceful, just long enough to steal the air from her lungs and send a wave of gasps crashing through the room like a breaking tide. Ava's mind went blank, her fingers tightening around the tray as it slipped from her grasp and clattered softly against the polished floor. But she didn't hear it, didn't hear anything except the pounding of her own pulse and the echo of 100 unspoken questions. Because this wasn't real, it couldn't be real, and yet when he pulled back, his hand was still around her wrist, anchoring her in place as the silence stretched unbearably thin. I'm not marrying her, Ethan said, his voice calm, almost too calm, and the words seemed to land heavier than the kiss itself, because they weren't just directed at the woman in the gown. They were meant for everyone, for the family gathered in quiet judgment, for the business partners watching with calculating eyes, for the entire world that had already decided how his life was supposed to go. And Ava felt the weight of it press down on her shoulders, even though she didn't understand why she was suddenly standing at the center of it. You're making a mistake, someone muttered, low but audible. And Ava's stomach twisted because she knew exactly what they saw when they looked at her. Not a person, not someone with dreams or fears or a life beyond this uniform, just a problem, a disruption, a girl who didn't belong in a room like this. Come with me, Ethan said under his breath, his voice dropping just enough to cut through her panic, and before she could protest, before she could even find the words, he guided her away from the crowd, past the stunned faces and the whispered accusations, through a hallway that seemed impossibly quiet after the storm they had just left behind, until the noise faded completely and all that was left was the sound of her uneven breathing and the steady, controlled rhythm of his footsteps. What was that? Ava finally managed, her voice shaking despite her effort to steady it, and when he stopped, turning to face her in the dim light of a private study lined with books she knew she would never have the time to read, she saw it again, that same tension, that same edge beneath the surface of a man who was supposed to have everything under control. A solution, he said simply, and before she could respond, before she could even begin to understand what he meant, he reached for a folder on the desk and slid it toward her. The paper crisp, deliberate, As if this moment had been waiting for her long before she ever stepped into that room. Ava hesitated, her fingers hovering over the edge of the document, her mind racing through every possible reason she should walk away, every instinct screaming that this was dangerous, that this was bigger than her, bigger than anything she could handle. But then she thought of the bills sitting unpaid on her kitchen table, of her mother's voice trying to sound strong over the phone, of the quiet desperation that had followed her into every shift, and slowly, reluctantly, she picked up the paper. 30 days. Ethan said, his gaze steady, unreadable. You pretend to be mine, and I'll make sure you never have to worry about money again. And the room seemed to tilt slightly as the reality of his words settled in, because this wasn't just a kiss, it wasn't just a moment, it was a deal, a line drawn between the life she knew and something else entirely, something she wasn't sure she could step into without losing herself. And yet as she looked down at the contract, at the clean, precise lines that promised everything she had ever needed and nothing she had ever wanted, Ava realized with a sinking certainty that walking away might not be an option anymore. Ava stared at the contract as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less dangerous. But they did not. They stayed sharp and clear, black ink on white paper. 30 days, a fixed amount wired to her account, strict rules written in clean legal language, and at the bottom a blank line waiting for her signature like it had all the patience in the world. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the page as she looked up at Ethan, searching his face for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that would make this feel less real, but he stood there composed, hands in his pockets, as if this was just another decision in a long list of decisions he made every day. And maybe for him it was. Maybe for him this was simple, controlled, temporary, but for her it felt like stepping onto a bridge she could not see the end of. You kissed me in front of your entire family, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. And now you expect me to pretend that meant something? Ethan's jaw tightened just enough to betray a flicker of tension, and he exhaled slowly, as if choosing his words with care. I expect you to help me avoid a marriage that was never my choice. And in return, I make sure your problems disappear. And there it was again, that wordless implication, that her life, her struggles, everything she had been carrying could be reduced to a problem he could solve with a signature and a transfer. And Ava felt something inside her push back, a quiet resistance that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with being seen as more than a transaction. I am not a solution, she said softly, and for the first time his eyes shifted, really looked at her, not as an employee, not as a convenient escape, but as a person standing in front of him with her own limits, her own lines she was not sure she could cross. No, he replied after a beat, his voice lower now, less certain. You are an opportunity, and the word hung between them, strange and unfinished, because it did not quite explain why he had chosen her, out of everyone, out of every option available to a man like him. And Ava could not ignore the question forming in the back of her mind. Why her? Why the maid who had barely been in this house for 2 weeks? Why someone who had spent most of her life trying to stay invisible in rooms like the one he had just dragged her out of? Why me? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. And for a moment, Ethan did not answer, his gaze drifting toward the window where the city lights stretched endlessly into the night, each building a reminder of the world he controlled and the expectations he was trying to escape. Because you do not belong to that world, he said finally, nodding toward the door they had come through, toward the echo of voices still lingering in the distance. And that is exactly why they will believe it. And Ava felt the weight of those words settle in her chest, because he was right, painfully right. Her presence beside him would disrupt everything, challenge everything. And that was the point. She was not supposed to fit. She was supposed to make a statement. She looked back down at the contract, at the numbers that could change everything for her and her family, at the clean promises that came with invisible costs. And she thought about the nights she had stayed awake calculating how long she could stretch what little she had, about the phone calls she avoided because she did not have answers, about the quiet exhaustion that followed her even into sleep. And slowly, almost without realizing it, she picked up the pen resting beside the paper. 30 days. She repeated under her breath, as if saying it out loud might make it feel smaller, more manageable, and Ethan gave a slight nod. 30 days, he confirmed, and there was something in his tone that suggested he had already counted them, already planned them out, already decided how this would begin and how it would end. Ava hesitated for one last second, her hand hovering over the line, and then she signed, her name flowing across the paper in a way that felt both final and unreal. And as soon as the ink dried, Ethan reached forward and closed the folder, sealing the deal with a quiet, decisive motion that made her stomach tighten. "You will need new clothes," he said, already shifting into action, already moving forward as if the hardest part was done. "And you will need to learn how to stand beside me without looking like you are about to run." And Ava almost laughed at that, a short, disbelieving sound that escaped before she could stop it. "Maybe that is because I am," she said, and for the briefest moment, something like amusement flickered across his face, quick and unexpected. "Then we will fix that too," he replied. And just like that, the balance shifted again, from negotiation to preparation, from uncertainty to something that felt dangerously like inevitability. Minutes later, as Ava stepped back into the hallway, the noise from the party had returned, softer now but still present, a reminder that the world outside that room had not paused for her decision, had not slowed down to consider what she had just agreed to. And as she walked past the polished mirrors lining the walls, she caught her reflection, the same uniform, the same posture, but something in her eyes had changed, something that made her look like a stranger to herself, and she wondered, not for the first time, what would be left of her when those 30 days were over, because deals like this always came with a cost, even if it was not written in the contract. And as she reached the edge of the ballroom once more, the whispers started again, softer but sharper, and this time they were not just about a maid who had been out of place. They were about the woman who had just stepped into a role she was not sure she knew how to play. "Rule number 1. Ethan said quietly as Ava stepped fully back into the ballroom. "You do not look down." And his voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that did not invite argument, only adjustment. And Ava felt her shoulders instinctively straighten even as every part of her wanted to shrink under the weight of the stairs now turning toward them again. The music had resumed, but it sounded distant, like it belonged to another room, another life. And as Ethan's hand rested lightly at the small of her back, guiding her forward, Ava became painfully aware of every step she took, of the polished floor beneath her shoes, of the way conversations faltered as they passed, of the subtle shift in energy as people tried to reconcile what they had just witnessed with what they believed to be true. "Everyone is watching," she murmured under her breath, her voice tight, and Ethan did not look at her, his gaze fixed ahead. "That is the point," he replied, and something in the certainty of his answer made her chest tighten, because this was not just about him escaping a marriage. This was about making a statement loud enough that no one could ignore it. They stopped near the center of the room where the lighting was brighter, where the attention was unavoidable, and Ava felt it settle over her like a spotlight she could not step out of. And then one by one, the reactions began to surface, polite smiles that did not reach the eyes, raised brows that lingered a second too long, whispers exchanged behind carefully manicured hands, and Ava caught fragments as they drifted past her, not meant to be heard but impossible to miss. "Is that the maid? He cannot be serious. This is going too far." And each word pressed against her like a reminder of exactly where she stood in their world. "Smile," Ethan said softly, and Ava forced the corners of her lips upward, not because she felt anything close to calm, but because she understood that this was part of the role now, part of the agreement she had signed without fully knowing how it would feel to live it. And as she lifted her chin slightly, meeting the room instead of avoiding it, something shifted again, small but real, because she was not just reacting anymore. She was choosing how to stand in it. A man approached, older, his posture rigid with authority, his expression carefully controlled but not entirely masking the disapproval beneath it. "Ethan," he said, his voice low, measured. A word, and Ava felt the tension in Ethan's posture before he even responded, a subtle tightening that spoke louder than any reaction. "You can say it here," Ethan replied, and the man's gaze flicked to Ava, assessing, dismissive, lingering just long enough to make his opinion clear without a single direct insult. "This is not appropriate," he said, choosing his words as if they were part of a negotiation. You are making a spectacle. And Ava felt the familiar sting of being reduced to something less than human, something inconvenient, something out of place. But before she could retreat into that feeling, Ethan's voice cut through it, steady and unwavering. No, he said, I am making a choice. And for a brief moment, silence followed. Not the stunned silence from before, but something sharper, something edged with conflict. Because this was no longer just a shocking moment. It was a position being defended. The man's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze hardening. You will regret this, he said quietly, and then he turned, walking away with the kind of finality that suggested this conversation was not over, not by a long shot. And Ava exhaled slowly, not realizing she had been holding her breath. Was that your father? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, and Ethan nodded once, his expression unreadable. Yes, he said simply, and that single word carried more weight than any explanation. Before she could ask anything else, another presence stepped into the space. The woman in the gown from earlier, her composure restored but her eyes sharp with something Ava could not quite name. Anger, disbelief, maybe both. You embarrassed me, she said, her voice controlled but tight. And Ava felt the instinct to step back, to remove herself from a conversation that did not belong to her. But Ethan's hand remained steady at her back, grounding her in place. This was never about you, he replied, and the words landed harder than they sounded, because they stripped away the illusion that this had ever been a mutual arrangement, revealing the truth beneath it, that this was something decided without her, something she had been expected to accept without question. You think this will work? The woman asked, her gaze finally settling fully on Ava. And this time there was no attempt to hide the judgment there, no effort to soften it into politeness. You think she belongs here? And Ava felt the question settle deep, because it was not just directed at Ethan, it was directed at her, at everything she represented in that moment. And for a second, doubt flickered, sharp and immediate. But then she remembered the contract, the choice she had made, the reasons she had stepped into this. And instead of looking away, she met the woman's gaze, steady, unflinching, and Ethan answered before she had to, his voice calm, certain. She belongs where I say she belongs. And the room seemed to hold its breath again, because this was no longer subtle, no longer something that could be ignored or explained away. It was a line drawn clearly in front of everyone watching. The woman's expression shifted, something colder settling in, something that promised this was not finished, and without another word, she turned and walked away, her heels echoing sharply against the floor, and Ava felt the aftermath of the exchange ripple through her, a mix of adrenaline and unease that made it hard to tell whether she was steady or about to fall apart. This is only the beginning, Ethan said quietly, almost to himself, and Ava turned her head slightly, studying him, trying to understand the man she had just agreed to stand beside. Because whatever she had stepped into, it was bigger than a simple deal, bigger than 30 days. And as the whispers around them grew louder again, no longer questioning what had happened, but speculating on what would happen next, Ava realized that she was no longer invisible, and there was no going back to that life. Not anymore. If you walk out now, they win, Ethan said quietly as the music swelled again, and Ava felt the words settle into her chest heavier than she expected, because she had been thinking exactly that, thinking about slipping away through one of the side doors, about returning to the quiet safety of being unseen. But now there was no safe version of this night left, no version where she could undo what had already been done. I did not sign up to be your weapon, she replied under her breath, keeping her expression composed as another group of guests passed by, their smiles polite, but their eyes sharp with curiosity. And Ethan's gaze shifted to her for a brief second, something almost like regret flickering there before it disappeared behind the same controlled calm he had worn all evening. You are not a weapon, he said. You are proof. And Ava frowned slightly, the word catching her off guard. Because proof of what? She wondered. Proof that he could break away from expectations. Or proof that someone like her could stand in a place that had never been built for her. Before she could ask, a woman approached. Older, elegant, her posture straight with the kind of quiet authority that did not need to be announced, and unlike the others, her eyes did not immediately dismiss Ava. Instead they studied her carefully, thoughtfully, as if trying to understand rather than judge. "Ethan," she said, her voice calm, measured. "You have created quite the conversation tonight." And there was no accusation in her tone, only observation, which somehow made it more unsettling. "That was the intention," Ethan replied, and Ava felt the subtle shift in his stance again, the way he seemed to brace himself around certain people, as if their opinions mattered more than the rest. The woman's gaze moved to Ava, not unkind, but not warm either. "And you are?" she asked, leaving space for Ava to answer. And for a split second, Ava hesitated, the old instinct to deflect, to shrink, to let someone else speak for her rising up. But then she remembered the contract, the role, the choice she had made, and she lifted her chin slightly. "Ava Brooks," she said, her voice steady, clear, and the woman nodded slowly, as if filing the name away for later. "Well, Ava Brooks," she said, "this will not be an easy place for you." And there was something in the way she said it that felt less like a warning and more like a fact, simple and unavoidable, and Ava gave a small, controlled smile. "I did not expect it to be," she replied, and for the first time that evening, the woman's expression softened just slightly, a hint of approval passing through her eyes before she turned back to Ethan. "Make sure you understand the consequences of this," she said quietly, and then she walked away, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the others, heavier, more personal. "Who was that?" Ava asked, and Ethan exhaled slowly. "My mother," he said, and the answer landed with a weight that explained everything. The restraint, the careful words, the unspoken tension, and Ava felt a new layer of complexity settle over the situation. Because this was not just about business or appearances, this was about family, expectations that had been built long before she ever entered the picture. She did not look surprised, Ava said, and Ethan gave a faint, humorless smile. "She is never surprised," he replied, and for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller, like two people standing on the same side of something rather than opposite ends of a deal. The night continued around them, conversations resuming, laughter returning in cautious waves, but the energy had shifted, and Ava could feel it in every glance, every whispered comment, every polite interaction that carried something sharper beneath the surface. And as the minutes passed, she realized that this was not a single moment she had to survive. It was a role she had to maintain, constantly, carefully, without slipping. "Stay close," Ethan said as another group approached, and this time when his hand brushed lightly against her back, guiding her forward, it felt less like control and more like coordination, like they were moving through this together. Even if the reasons behind it were not the same. The questions came, subtle at first, then more direct. "How did you meet? How long has this been going on? Why have we never heard about you?" And Ava answered carefully, choosing her words with precision, offering just enough to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything that would unravel the fragile structure they had built. And with each response, her confidence grew, not because the situation became easier, but because she began to understand how to stand within it without losing herself. "You are doing fine," Ethan murmured at one point, and Ava almost laughed at the understatement, because nothing about this felt fine, but she understood what he meant. She was holding her ground. She was not breaking, and that alone felt like a quiet victory. As the night stretched on, the initial shock faded into something more dangerous, something quieter, more calculated, because people were no longer reacting, they were observing, assessing, deciding what this meant for them, for their alliances, for the carefully balanced world they were part of. And Ava realized that the hardest part was not the moment of exposure. It was what came after, the slow, constant pressure of being watched, measured, judged. And yet, despite everything, there was a moment, brief and unexpected, when the noise faded just enough for her to notice something else. The way Ethan's posture relaxed slightly when he thought no one was looking. The way his gaze lingered on her for a second longer than necessary, as if trying to understand her the same way she was trying to understand him. And in that moment, the deal they had made felt less like a transaction and more like the beginning of something neither of them had fully anticipated, something uncertain and fragile, but undeniably real. And as the night carried on, Ava realized that surviving this world would not just require her to play a role. It would require her to redefine what that role meant, not just for them, but but for herself. Tomorrow, everything changes, Ethan said as the last guests began to leave, his voice low enough that only Ava could hear it. And she glanced at him, trying to read whether that was a warning or a promise, but his expression remained composed, distant again, like whatever had softened earlier had already been locked away. The ballroom was slowly emptying, the music fading into the background as staff moved quietly to clear glasses and fold away the illusion of perfection. And Ava suddenly felt the weight of exhaustion settle into her bones, not just from the long night, but from everything it had demanded of her, every look she had endured, every word she had measured, every second she had forced herself to stand where she did not belong. "I thought tonight was the hard part," she said softly, and Ethan shook his head once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Tonight was the announcement," he replied. "Tomorrow is the reality." And something about the way he said it made her chest tighten, because announcements could be ignored, dismissed as drama, but reality had a way of settling in, of forcing people to respond. They walked through the now quiet hallway, the polished floors reflecting their footsteps in soft echoes, and Ava became aware again of how different everything felt from just a few hours ago, when she had been moving through these same spaces unnoticed, invisible. And now every step carried a new awareness, a new weight, like the walls themselves had shifted to acknowledge her presence. "What exactly happens tomorrow?" she asked, and Ethan paused briefly before answering, as if deciding how much to reveal. "You move upstairs," he said, "into the main residence," and Ava stopped walking, the words catching her off guard. "Upstairs," she repeated, and he nodded. "If this is going to work, you cannot be seen as staff anymore." And there it was again, that clear line between who she had been and who she was expected to become, drawn so simply in his world, but in hers it felt like crossing into something she did not fully understand. "And what about the rest of the staff?" she asked, her voice tightening slightly, because she knew those people had stood beside them, had shared quiet moments in the kitchen and the back hallways, had existed in that space where no one paid attention. And now she was being asked to step out of it as if it had never been hers. "They will adjust," Ethan said, and Ava almost laughed at how easy he made it sound, as if adjustment was just a switch people could flip, as if it did not come with questions and resentment and distance. "Or they will judge," she said quietly, and for a moment, Ethan did not respond, and that silence told her enough, because he knew it too. He just did not consider it something that would change his decision. They reached the staircase, wide and elegant, leading upward into a part of the house Ava had only ever seen from a distance, and she hesitated at the bottom step, her hand brushing lightly against the polished railing, as if she needed something solid to anchor herself before taking the next step. "You can still walk away," Ethan said suddenly, and Ava looked at him, surprised by the unexpected offer, because nothing about his actions so far had suggested he would give her an easy exit. "The contract is signed," she replied, and he nodded. "Yes, but I am not forcing you to stay." And there was something different in his tone now, less controlled, more honest, like this was not part of the plan but something he needed to say anyway. Ava held his gaze for a moment, searching for something she could trust, something that felt real in the middle of everything that was not. And then she shook her head slightly. "I made my choice," she said, and as the words left her mouth, she realized she meant them, not just because of the money, not just because of the situation she was in, but because something inside her refused to step back into the life she had just stepped out of, refused to pretend this had not happened. Ethan studied her for a second longer, then gave a small nod, as if accepting her answer, and turned toward the stairs, beginning to climb, and after a brief hesitation, Ava followed. Each step felt heavier than the last, not physically, but in what it represented, a shift she could not undo. And as they reached the top, the space opened into a different world entirely, quieter, more private, the lighting softer, the atmosphere less about display and more about control. And Ava realized that this was where the real version of Ethan Cole lived, not the one the world saw, but the one hidden behind closed doors. "This is your room," he said, stopping in front of a door and opening it. And Ava stepped inside slowly, her eyes taking in the space, the large windows overlooking the city, the bed perfectly made, the furniture elegant but understated, everything carefully arranged as if waiting for someone who had never arrived until now. "This is not temporary," she said without thinking, and Ethan leaned lightly against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "Nothing about this is," he replied, and the words lingered in the air between them, heavier than they should have been, because they hinted at something beyond the 30 days, something neither of them had agreed to but could not entirely ignore. Ava walked further into the room, her fingers brushing lightly against the surface of a desk, grounding herself in something tangible, something real, and as she turned back to face him, she felt the shift fully settle in, the understanding that tonight had not just changed how others saw her, it had changed how she would have to see herself, and there was no clear path forward, no simple way to navigate what came next, only the knowledge that she had stepped into a world that would test her in ways she had never experienced before. And as Ethan watched her from the doorway, silent, thoughtful, Ava realized that whatever this arrangement was supposed to be, it was already becoming something far more complicated than either of them had planned. "Do not forget who you are," Ava whispered to her own reflection as the door clicked shut behind Ethan, and the silence that followed felt louder than the entire ballroom had been just hours ago. The room was still, untouched, almost too perfect, and for a moment she just stood there, her hands resting at her sides, unsure of where to move or what to do next, because nothing about this felt natural. Nothing about this felt like something she could simply step into and accept. She walked slowly toward the window, her footsteps soft against the carpet, and when she reached the glass, the city stretched out before her in endless lights, each one a reminder of how small she had always felt in a world like this. And yet tonight she was standing above it, not below it, not hidden behind it, but placed right in the middle of it, and that shift was both thrilling and terrifying in a way she could not quite put into words. Her reflection stared back at her, still dressed in the same uniform, the same person she had been that morning, but something in her eyes had changed, something sharper, more aware, and she reached up slowly, brushing her fingers against her cheek as if to confirm that she was still real, still herself. A soft knock broke the silence, and Ava turned quickly, her heart skipping a beat before she steadied herself. "Come in," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, and the door opened just slightly, revealing a woman she recognized from downstairs, older, composed, her expression neutral but not unkind. "Miss Brooks," the woman said, stepping inside with careful formality. "I have been asked to assist you." And Ava felt a flicker of discomfort at the title, at the shift in how she was being addressed, because just hours ago she had been one of them, and now she was something else entirely. "You can call me Ava," she said gently, and the woman inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the request without fully accepting it. "Very well, Ava," she replied. "There are a few arrangements that need to be made before morning," and Ava nodded, even though she had no idea what those arrangements might be. Within minutes, the room filled with quiet activity. Garment bags were brought in, shoes placed carefully along the wall, jewelry laid out with precision, and Ava watched it all unfold with a sense of detachment, as if she were observing someone else's life being prepared in front of her. "These have been selected for you," the woman explained, gesturing toward the clothing. "Mr. Cole has a schedule planned for tomorrow, and appearances will need to be maintained," and Ava swallowed slightly, the words "appearances will need to be maintained" echoing in her mind, because that was what this was, not just a role, but an expectation she would have to meet consistently, without hesitation, without mistake. "I have never done anything like this before," Ava admitted quietly, and for the first time, the woman's expression softened just a fraction. "No one ever has, the first time," she said, and there was something in her tone that felt almost reassuring, even if it was wrapped in formality. After everything was arranged, the woman paused at the door, glancing back at Ava as if considering something. "It is not the room that defines you," she said simply. "It is how you stand in it." And then she left, closing the door softly behind her, and Ava stood there for a long moment, letting those words settle, because they felt important in a way she could not yet fully understand. She moved slowly toward the bed, sitting down carefully, her hands resting in her lap as she stared at the clothes laid out before her, the fabrics rich, unfamiliar, belonging to a world she had only ever seen from the outside. and she reached out, touching one of the dresses lightly, feeling the smoothness beneath her fingers, wondering what it would feel like to wear something like that and not feel like an outsider. Her thoughts drifted back to the kitchen downstairs, to the quiet conversations, the shared glances, the sense of belonging she had found in a place that had never truly valued her. And now she was being asked to leave that behind, to step into something new without knowing if there would be anything to hold on to if she fell. A soft vibration pulled her from her thoughts, and she reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone, the screen lighting up with a name she knew all too well. And for a moment she hesitated, her thumb hovering over the answer button, before she finally pressed it. "Mom," she said softly, and the familiar sound of her mother's voice on the other end brought a sudden wave of emotion she had not been prepared for. "Ava, are you okay?" her mother asked, concern evident even through the distance. And Ava took a slow breath, steadying herself, because how could she explain this? How could she put into words everything that had happened in just a few hours? "I am working late," she said carefully, choosing the safest version of the truth, and her mother paused for a moment, as if sensing there was more beneath the surface, but not pressing. "Just take care of yourself," she said gently, and Ava closed her eyes briefly, holding onto those words like an anchor. "I will," she promised, even though she was not entirely sure how. After the call ended, the silence returned, but it felt different now, less overwhelming, more grounding, and Ava stood up slowly, walking back toward the mirror, her gaze steady as she looked at herself again, and this time, instead of questioning what she saw, she straightened her shoulders slightly, lifting her chin just enough to change the way she held herself, because if she was going to step into this role, she would not do it halfway. She would not allow herself to be reduced to something less than she was. And as she turned off the lights and prepared for a night she knew would not come easily, Ava made a quiet decision, one that was not written in any contract, not spoken out loud, but just as binding, that no matter how this arrangement played out, she would not lose herself in it. Not for anyone, not even for a man who had just changed the course of her life with a single, unexpected choice. "You have exactly 15 minutes, came a calm voice from the doorway the next morning, and Ava opened her eyes to a reality that felt both distant and immediate, as if she had only just closed them moments ago. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long, golden lines across the room, and for a brief second she forgot where she was, until the unfamiliar ceiling, the silence, and the neatly arranged clothes pulled her back into the truth of everything that had changed. She sat up, slowly, her heart already racing, not from fear exactly, but from the awareness that today would not allow her to hesitate, not even for a second. 15 minutes, she repeated, her voice still soft with sleep, and the woman from the night before nodded once, composed as ever. "Breakfast with Mr. Cole's mother is at 9 o'clock sharp," she said, and Ava felt a small, immediate tension tighten in her chest, because out of everything she had expected, that was not the first challenge she thought she would face. She moved quickly, stepping into the bathroom, the cool marble under her feet grounding her as she splashed water on her face, staring at her reflection again, searching for the version of herself that could handle what was coming. And for a moment she saw doubt flicker there, but she pushed it down, straightening her shoulders, reminding herself that she had already survived last night, and this was simply the next step. When she returned, the outfit laid out for her caught her attention immediately, elegant but not overly dramatic, a soft neutral tone that felt deliberate, calculated to present her as refined without drawing unnecessary attention, and as she slipped into it, she noticed how differently it fit, not just physically, but emotionally, like stepping into a role she was still learning how to carry. "You look appropriate," the woman said once Ava was ready, and Ava almost smiled at the choice of word. Appropriate. Not beautiful, not impressive, just acceptable. And maybe that was exactly what she needed to be right now. The walk to the dining room felt longer than it should have, each step echoing with quiet anticipation, and when they reached the door, Ava paused for just a fraction of a second before stepping inside. The room was bright, filled with natural light, the table set with precision, every detail intentional, and at the head of it sat Ethan's mother, already composed, already waiting, as if she had been there long before Ava even woke up. Ethan was seated beside her, his posture relaxed but his presence unmistakable, and when his eyes met Ava's, there was a brief moment of acknowledgement, something subtle that grounded her just enough to take the next step forward. "Good morning," his mother said, her tone polite but distant, and Ava returned the greeting, her voice steady despite the tension she felt building beneath the surface. She took her seat, carefully mirroring the movements she had observed, aware that every gesture mattered, every detail was being noticed, and for a few moments, the conversation remained light, controlled, centered around neutral topics that required no real answers, only the ability to participate without revealing too much. "Tell me, Ava," his mother said after a pause, her gaze settling fully on her now. "What do you see when you look at this situation?" And the question caught Ava off guard, not because of its content, but because of its depth, because it was not about appearances or explanations, it was about perspective, and Ava felt the weight of it as she considered her response. "I see something unexpected," she said carefully, choosing her words with intention, "and something that will not be easy." And there was a brief silence, as if the honesty of her answer had shifted something in the room, and Ethan's mother studied her for a moment longer before nodding slightly. "That is a fair assessment," she replied, and Ava felt a small, almost imperceptible release of tension, not approval exactly, but not rejection either, and in this environment, that felt like a significant difference. "And what do you expect from my son?" The question followed, more direct this time, and Ava glanced briefly at Ethan before answering, not for guidance, but to acknowledge that he was part of this conversation, part of this dynamic she was still trying to understand. "Clarity," she said, her voice steady, "and respect," and Ethan's gaze sharpened slightly at her words, not in disagreement, but in recognition, as if she had just defined something that had not yet been spoken out loud. His mother leaned back slightly, considering her answer, and for a moment, the room felt balanced on something fragile, something that could shift with a single misstep, but then she nodded again, more decisively this time. "Good," she said simply, and the conversation moved on, but Ava knew that something had been established, something that would shape everything that followed. As breakfast continued, Ava found herself adjusting, not just to the environment, but to the rhythm of it, the way conversations were layered, the way meanings were often hidden beneath polite words, and she realized that surviving here would require more than confidence. It would require awareness, the ability to read what was not being said as much as what was. When the meal ended, Ethan stood, signaling the close of the interaction, and as they stepped out into the hallway, away from the controlled atmosphere of the dining room, Ava exhaled slowly, the tension she had been holding finally releasing just enough for her to feel it. "You handled that well," Ethan said, his voice quieter now, less formal, and Ava glanced at him, a small hint of disbelief crossing her expression. "I answered honestly," she replied, and he gave a slight nod. "That is exactly why it worked." And for a moment, they stood there in a silence that felt different from the others, less about tension and more about understanding. And Ava realized that whatever this arrangement was supposed to be, it was already beginning to shift, not just in how others saw them, but in how they were starting to see each other. "This is where people stop pretending," Ethan said as they stepped into the glass-walled conference room overlooking the city, and Ava immediately understood that whatever quiet understanding had begun forming between them would now be tested in a very different way. The room was already filled, men and women in tailored suits seated around a long polished table, their conversations low but deliberate, and as the door opened, every voice faded just enough to acknowledge their entrance, not with warmth, but with calculation. Ava felt it instantly, the shift from curiosity to scrutiny, from whispers behind closed doors to judgments made in plain sight, and she straightened her posture without thinking, remembering every word, every look from the night before, reminding herself that she had chosen to be here, even if she was still learning what that meant. "Good morning," Ethan said evenly, his tone professional now, controlled in a way that made it clear this was his domain, and the responses came back in polite unison. But Ava noticed the hesitation, the way some of them glanced at her before answering, as if recalibrating their expectations in real time. "This is Ava Brooks," Ethan continued, his voice steady. She will be joining us today. And the statement was simple, but the reaction it triggered was not. A subtle tightening around the table, a flicker of surprise in some eyes, skepticism in others, and Ava could almost hear the unspoken question moving through the room. Why is she here? She took the seat beside Ethan, aware of every movement, every glance. And as the meeting began, she focused on listening, on understanding the rhythm of the conversation, the language of business that moved quickly and precisely, leaving little room for hesitation. Numbers were discussed, projections analyzed, decisions debated with a level of intensity that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with control. And Ava realized quickly that this world operated on a different kind of power, one that was not always visible, but always present. We cannot move forward with this plan, a man across the table said, his tone firm. The risk is too high. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his expression calm but focused. The risk is calculated, he replied, and necessary. And Ava watched the exchange closely, noticing the way he held his ground without raising his voice, the way authority could exist without aggression. And for the first time, she saw him not just as the man who had pulled her into this situation, but as someone who navigated pressure with a kind of quiet precision she had not expected. And your judgment is not influenced by recent developments? Another voice added, the pause before the last word deliberate, and Ava felt the room shift again, the focus narrowing, the question no longer about business but about her, about what she represented, and whether it affected his decisions. Ethan's gaze did not waver. My judgment is based on facts, he said, and the simplicity of the answer left no room for further argument. But Ava could feel the tension lingering, the doubt not fully addressed but temporarily set aside. As the discussion continued, she found herself following more closely, recognizing patterns, understanding the logic behind certain decisions, and when a particular point was raised about community impact, something in her shifted, something that pushed her forward before she could fully think it through. That approach overlooks the people it affects directly, she said, her voice clear but unexpected in the room, and for a moment, everything stopped, the conversation halting as all eyes turned to her, not just with curiosity now, but with surprise, because she had stepped outside the role they had assumed for her. Ava felt the weight of that attention, but she did not back down. If you only measure success in numbers, you miss the cost that does not show up on a report, she continued, and the silence that followed was different this time, not dismissive, but considering, as if her words had introduced something that had not been accounted for. Ethan looked at her then, not with shock, but with something closer to recognition, and after a brief pause, he nodded slightly. Continue, he said, giving her space to speak, and Ava did, explaining her perspective in a way that felt natural, grounded in real experiences rather than abstract calculations. And as she spoke, she noticed the shift in the room, the way skepticism gave way to attention, the way people leaned in slightly, listening not because they expected to agree, but because they had not expected her to have something worth hearing. When she finished, there was a moment of quiet, and then one of the executives nodded slowly. That is a valid point, he admitted, and Ava felt something settle inside her, not relief exactly, but a sense of confirmation, that she could exist in this space without losing herself, without becoming something she was not. The meeting moved on, but the dynamic had changed, subtly but unmistakably, and Ava realized that this was how she would have to navigate this world, not by trying to fit into it completely, but by bringing something different into it, something it was not used to but could not entirely ignore. As they stood to leave, the same man who had questioned Ethan earlier approached them, his expression thoughtful now rather than critical. Miss Brooks, he said, addressing her directly. You made an interesting contribution, and Ava met his gaze calmly. Thank you, she replied, and as he walked away, she turned slightly toward Ethan, who was watching her with a quiet intensity she had not seen before. You were not supposed to speak, he said, but there was no reprimand in his tone, only observation, and Ava raised an eyebrow slightly. You told me to stand beside you, she replied, not behind you. And for a brief moment, something like a smile touched his expression, quick and subtle, but real, and as they stepped out of the room together, Ava realized that whatever role she had been expected to play, She was already beginning to redefine it on her own terms. You just made yourself visible, Ethan said as the elevator doors closed behind them, his voice low but carrying a weight Ava had not heard before, and she turned slightly toward him, still feeling the lingering tension from the room they had just left, the echo of eyes watching her, reassessing her, recalculating her place in a world that had already decided where she belonged. I already was, she replied, her tone steady. But there was a quiet awareness behind it now, because visibility here did not mean the same thing it did in her old life. Here it meant being evaluated, challenged, sometimes even targeted, and as the elevator began to descend, the silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but charged with everything that had not yet been said. There is a difference, Ethan continued after a moment, his gaze fixed ahead, between being noticed and being remembered, and Ava felt the words settle in her mind, because she understood what he meant, understood that what she had done in that room would not fade into the background. It would follow her, shape how people interacted with her moving forward. The elevator doors opened into the main lobby, where the energy shifted again, faster, louder, more public, and Ava stepped out. Beside him, aware that this was no longer a controlled environment like the conference room. This was where perception spread, where narratives were built in seconds. Mr. Cole, a voice called out, and before Ava could react, a group of reporters approached, cameras already raised, microphones extended with practiced precision, and the suddenness of it made her heart race, because this was not part of anything she had prepared for. Is it true? One of them asked quickly, are you calling off the engagement? And Ethan did not break stride, his expression calm, controlled, but Ava could feel the shift in his presence, the way he seemed to step fully into a role she had only glimpsed before. I have made my position clear, he said evenly, and the questions came faster, overlapping, pressing for more. And who is she? Another voice pushed, turning toward Ava, the attention snapping onto her with a force that felt almost physical, and for a brief second, she froze, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that this was no longer contained. This was not just inside the walls of his home or his office. This was everywhere. Ethan's hand moved slightly, just enough to signal without drawing attention, grounding her in place. This is Ava Brooks, he said, his voice steady. And she is with me. And the statement, simple as it was, landed with a clarity that cut through the noise. And Ava felt every camera turn fully toward her, every lens capturing her expression, her posture, her reaction, and she remembered everything, every moment from the night before, every decision she had made. And instead of stepping back, she held her ground. Miss Brooks, how did you meet? A reporter asked, and Ava glanced briefly at Ethan, not for permission, but for alignment, and then she answered, her voice clear, controlled. We met when neither of us expected it, she said. And there was a murmur among the reporters, the kind that came from an answer that gave just enough, without revealing anything. Are you aware of the implications of this relationship? Another question followed, sharper this time, and Ava felt the edge beneath it, the challenge, the assumption that she did not belong in this narrative. And for a moment, she considered deflecting, stepping back into silence, but something in her refused to do that. Not now, not after. Everything. I am aware of where I stand, she replied, and the words came out steady, grounded, and the subtle shift in the room was immediate, because she had not avoided the question, she had answered it on her own terms. Ethan glanced at her then, just briefly, but there was something new in his expression, something that had not been there before, not just approval, but recognition, as if he was seeing her in a way that went beyond the arrangement they had made. Security moved in quietly, creating space, guiding them forward, and as they stepped away from the crowd, Ava exhaled slowly, the adrenaline settling into something steadier, something she could control. You handled that better than most people would, Ethan said once they were out of earshot, and Ava gave a small, almost incredulous smile. I did not have time to think about it, she admitted, and he nodded slightly. That is usually when the truth shows, he replied, and for a moment, they walked in silence, the city, moving around them, unaware of the shift that had just taken place. But as they reached the car waiting outside, Ava noticed something else, a small group of people across the street, watching, not with curiosity, but with judgment, their expressions hard, their whispers not hidden, and she caught fragments again. Familiar, cutting. He replaced her with that. This is not going to last, and Ava felt the sting of it, not because she had not expected it, but because it was louder now, more public, harder to ignore. She paused for just a second before getting into the car, her hand resting lightly on the door, and Ethan noticed, his gaze following hers toward the group, his expression tightening just slightly. "You do not have to listen to them," he said, and Ava looked at him, something steady settling in her chest. "I am not listening," she replied. "I am remembering." And the distinction hung between them, because she was not just hearing the words, she was understanding what they represented, the resistance, the doubt, the assumptions that would follow her no matter where she stood. As the car door closed and the noise of the street faded, Ava leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting to the window, watching the city pass by in a blur of motion and light, and she realized that this was not just about proving something to others anymore. It was about deciding what she would accept, what she would challenge, and who she would become in a world that was already trying to define her. And beside her, Ethan remained quiet. But there was a shift in the silence, something more aware, more intentional, as if he too was beginning to understand that whatever this arrangement had started as, it was no longer something either of them could fully control. "Do you trust me?" Ethan asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the car as it moved through the city, and Ava turned her head slightly, caught off guard by the question, because it was not something she had expected him to ask, not now, not after everything that had happened. She studied him for a moment, the way his gaze remained forward, focused on the road ahead as if the answer mattered, but he was not ready to face it directly, and she felt the weight of the question settle between them, heavier than it sounded. "I signed a contract with you," she replied carefully, her tone even. "That is not the same as trust." And for a brief moment, something shifted in his expression, not frustration, not disappointment, but recognition, as if he had expected that answer and accepted it. "Fair," he said quietly, and the conversation might have ended there. But Ava found herself watching him more closely now, noticing the tension in his posture, the way his fingers tapped once lightly against his knee before stilling again, and it made her wonder what had prompted the question in the first place. The car slowed as they pulled into the driveway of the estate, the gates closing behind them with a quiet finality that felt symbolic in a way Ava could not ignore. And as they stepped out, the familiar structure of the house stood before her, but it no longer felt like the same place it had been just the day before. It felt different now, heavier with expectations, with consequences that were beginning to take shape. "There is something you need to understand," Ethan said as they walked inside, his voice lower now, more serious, and Ava glanced at him, sensing the shift immediately, because this was not about appearances or strategy. This was something else. "The reaction today will not stay contained," he continued. "It will spread, and when it does, people will start looking for reasons, for explanations, for anything they can use to make sense of it." And Ava felt a quiet tension build in her chest, because she already understood what that meant. She had seen it in the way people looked at her, in the way they spoke about her when they thought she could not hear. "And what will they find?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with something sharper now, and Ethan paused for just a fraction of a second before answering. "Whatever they want to see," he said, and the honesty of it landed harder than any reassurance could have, because it confirmed what she already knew, that this was not just about proving herself. It was about navigating a narrative that had already been written without her. They stepped into the house, the quiet interior contrasting sharply with the noise of the outside world. But Ava could feel the shift even here, the subtle difference in the way the staff moved, the way conversations paused as they passed, not out of disrespect, but out of uncertainty, because she was no longer clearly one of them, but not fully something else either. "You are not going to explain any of this, are you?" she asked, stopping near the base of the staircase, and Ethan turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "Explanations do not change minds," he said. "Actions do." And Ava held his gaze, considering his words, because they sounded true, but they also sounded like something that would take time. Time she was not sure she had in a situation that was already escalating. Before she could respond, a voice cut through the space, sharp, controlled. "So this is what you have decided." And Ava turned to see the woman from the night before stepping into view, her presence commanding, her expression composed, but her eyes carrying a tension that had not been there earlier. Ethan straightened slightly, his posture shifting in a way Ava recognized. Now, not defensive, but prepared. "I have," he replied, and the woman's gaze moved to Ava, assessing, measuring, and this time there was no attempt to soften it, no polite distance, just direct evaluation. "Do you understand what you have stepped into?" she asked, her tone calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight, and Ava felt the question settle in her chest, because it was not asked with cruelty, but with expectation, as if the answer mattered more than anything else in that moment. Ava met her gaze steadily. "I understand that it will not be easy," she said, echoing her words from before. But this time there was something firmer behind them, something more certain, and the woman studied her for a moment longer before speaking again. "It is not just about difficulty," she said. "It is about endurance," and the word lingered, heavier than the rest, because it implied something ongoing, something that would not resolve quickly or cleanly. Ethan stepped forward slightly, his presence shifting the dynamic just enough to redirect the focus. "This is not up for discussion," he said, his voice calm but final, and the woman's gaze flicked to him, a silent exchange passing between them that Ava could not fully read, but could feel the intensity of. After a moment, the woman nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and then she turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence that felt more charged than before. Ava exhaled slowly, the tension she had been holding finally surfacing. "You knew this would happen," she said, and Ethan did not deny it. "Yes," he replied simply, and Ava looked at him, something shifting inside her, because this was not just a situation she had stepped into, it was one he had created, one he had chosen despite knowing exactly what it would bring. "And you still did it," she said, and he met her gaze directly now. No distance, no deflection. "Yes," he repeated, and for a moment, the weight of that choice settled between them, not as a question, but as a fact, one that neither of them could ignore. Ava turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the staircase, toward the room that was no longer just a place to sleep, but a symbol of everything that had changed, and she realized that whatever doubts she still carried, whatever uncertainty remained, it was already too late to step back into the life she had before, because this was no longer just about him, or the contract, or even the world they were navigating. It was about who she would become within it, and as she stood there, steady and unyielding, Ava understood that the next step would not be about surviving. It would be about deciding how far she was willing to go to claim a place that had never been meant for her. "You are starting to believe you belong here," Ethan said quietly that evening, and Ava paused mid-step at the top of the staircase, turning slowly toward him because the words were not accusatory, but they carried a weight that made her question what he meant, and more importantly, what he saw. "Is that a problem?" she asked, her voice calm, but edged with something sharper now, because she had spent her entire life being told where she did not belong, and she was not willing to accept that. Again without question, Ethan studied her for a moment, his gaze steady, thoughtful. "It depends on what you think this is," he replied, and Ava felt the shift immediately, because this was not about the house, or the people, or even the contract. This was about something deeper, something neither of them had fully defined. "It is an arrangement," she said, repeating the word as if grounding herself in it, reminding both of them of the lines that had been drawn from the beginning, and Ethan nodded slightly. But there was something in his expression that suggested the word was no longer as simple as it had been before. "Then do not forget that," he said, and the quiet finality of it settled between them, not as a warning, but as a reminder, and Ava felt a flicker of something unexpected, not doubt exactly, but awareness, because she had started to move through this world with a kind of confidence that had not existed before, and now she was being asked to question whether that confidence belonged to her or to the role she was playing. "I have not forgotten anything," she replied, her voice steady, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them, filled with everything that had changed in such a short time. The sound of footsteps interrupted the moment, quick, purposeful, and Ava turned to see one of the staff members approaching, her expression tense. her movements less controlled than usual. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice tight. "There is something you should see." And Ethan's posture shifted instantly, the calm precision replaced by a sharper focus. "What is it?" he asked, and the woman hesitated for just a second before handing him a tablet. Ava watched as his eyes scanned the screen, his expression tightening in a way she had not seen before. Not anger, not panic, but something more controlled, more dangerous. And when he turned the screen slightly toward her, she understood why. Headlines filled the display, bold, immediate, impossible to ignore, images from earlier that day, from the moment outside the building, from the press, from the way she had stood beside him, and the words beneath them were exactly what she had expected and yet still felt like a blow, questioning her, reducing her, framing her as something she was not. "Maid turned partner," one headline read, and Ava felt the sting of it, not because it was surprising, but because it was so deliberate, so calculated to define her in a way that fit their narrative. "Is this a publicity stunt?" another asked, and Ava let out a slow breath, her gaze steady on the screen, because this was what Ethan had meant. This was how quickly it would spread, how easily it would be twisted into something that served everyone else's expectations. "They're going to keep pushing this," she said quietly, and Ethan nodded once, his jaw tightening slightly. "Yes," he replied, "they will." And Ava looked up at him, searching for something, not reassurance, but clarity. "And what are you going to do about it?" she asked, and for a moment, he did not answer, his gaze shifting back to the screen as if measuring something, calculating. "The next move." "Nothing," he said finally, and Ava blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the response. "Nothing," she repeated, and he met her gaze again, steady, unwavering. "If I respond, I validate it," he explained. "If I ignore it, it fades." And Ava felt the logic in his words, but she also felt the gap, the difference between how he experienced this and how she did. "It might fade for you," she said, her voice quieter now but more pointed. "But for me, this becomes part of how people see me," and the truth of it settled heavily in the space between them, because this was not just about headlines or reputation. It was about identity, about the way the world would now interpret everything she did. Ethan did not look away, did not dismiss what she said, and for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller again, like they were standing on the same side of a problem rather than opposite ends of an agreement. "Then we change what they see," he said, and the certainty in his voice was different this time, not just strategic, but intentional, and Ava held his gaze, considering his words, because changing perception was not something that happened overnight. It required consistency, resilience, something she was not sure she had been prepared for but was beginning to understand she would need. "And how do we do that?" she asked, and Ethan's expression shifted slightly, something more focused settling in. "By making sure they cannot ignore you," he said, and Ava felt the weight of that statement, because it was not about blending in or avoiding attention. It was about stepping into it fully, about owning a space that had never been offered to her. She glanced back at the screen one more time, at the headlines, the images, the narrative being built around her without her permission, and then she looked back at him, something steady forming in her chest, something that felt less like reaction and more like decision. "Then I will not give them the version they expect," she said, and the words came out firm, grounded, and Ethan nodded once, a small but meaningful acknowledgement, because in that moment, the arrangement they had started with shifted again, not into something undefined, but into something more deliberate, more equal, and as the screen dimmed and the room fell quiet once more, Ava realized that this was no longer just about surviving the world she had stepped into. It was about shaping it, one choice at a time. "Then we do not wait," Ava said the next morning, her voice steady as she stood near the window, sunlight outlining her figure in a way that made her look more certain than she felt. But certainty, she was learning, was often something you chose before you fully believed it. Ethan watched her from across the room, his expression thoughtful, measuring not just her words but the shift behind them, because this was no longer the same woman who had hesitated at the edge of every decision. This was someone who was beginning to move forward with intention, and that change mattered. "What are you proposing?" he asked, his tone calm but attentive. And Ava turned slightly, meeting his gaze with a clarity that had not been there before. "You said we change what they see," she replied. "So we stop reacting and start defining." And the words settled into the space between them, not as a challenge, but as a direction. Ethan considered it for a moment, then nodded once. A small but decisive gesture. "There is an event tonight," he said. "A charity gala. High visibility. Controlled environment." And Ava felt the weight of that immediately. Because controlled did not mean safe. It meant strategic. It meant every move would be watched, interpreted, judged. "Then that is where we start," she said. And there was no hesitation in her voice now. Only a quiet resolve that surprised even her. Hours later, as Ava stood in front of the mirror once again, the room around her filled with quiet preparation, she noticed the difference not in what she wore, but in how she carried it. The same careful selection of fabric and color, but a different presence beneath it. Something steadier, something that did not feel like it was trying to fit into a space, but rather claim it. "You look ready," the woman assisting her said, and Ava caught her own reflection, holding it for a moment longer than usual, not searching this time, but confirming, and then she nodded. "I am," she replied, and for the first time, it felt true. The arrival at the gala was nothing like the previous night. This time there was no element of surprise, no sudden disruption. Everything was expected, anticipated, and as the car door opened and Ava stepped out beside Ethan, the cameras were already there, the lights already focused, the questions already forming. But instead of reacting to it, she moved through it with purpose, her posture aligned, her gaze steady, and when Ethan's hand found hers, it was not a signal, not a strategy, it was a connection, brief, but real, grounding them both in the moment. "Stay with me," he said quietly, and Ava glanced at him, a small, almost knowing look passing between them. "I am not going anywhere," she replied, and the simplicity of the exchange carried more meaning than anything else that had been said. Inside, the atmosphere was polished, refined, but the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. Conversations paused as they entered, eyes followed them. Across the room, and Ava could feel the shift again. But this time it did not press against her, it moved around her, because she was not trying to disappear from it. She was moving through it. "They are waiting," Ethan murmured, and Ava nodded slightly, because she could see it too, the subtle grouping of people near the center, the ones who would define the tone of the evening. And without hesitation, they walked toward it. "Mr. Cole," someone greeted, their tone polite but edged with curiosity, and then the attention shifted, as it always did now, toward Ava, and this time, she did not wait for Ethan to speak. "Ava Brooks," she introduced herself, her voice clear, confident, and the slight pause that followed was different from before, not disbelief, but recalibration, as if the narrative they had expected was not aligning with what they were seeing. "We have been hearing quite a bit about you," a woman said, her smile measured, and Ava returned it, calm, composed. "Then I hope I can give you something accurate to remember," she replied, and Ethan's gaze flickered toward her briefly, a hint of approval, of recognition, because this was exactly what he had meant, not ignoring the narrative, but reshaping it. The evening unfolded with a rhythm Ava was beginning to understand, conversations layered with meaning, alliances hinted at in subtle exchanges, and through it all, she remained present, engaged, not as an outsider trying to navigate an unfamiliar world, but as someone actively participating in it, and the difference was undeniable. At one point, a conversation shifted toward a community initiative, and Ava found herself speaking again, not out of impulse this time, but with intention, sharing insights that reflected both her perspective and an understanding of the space she was in, and as she spoke, she saw it, the shift in the room, the way attention turned not out of curiosity, but out of respect, cautious, but real. "That is an interesting approach," someone said, and Ava nodded slightly. "It is a necessary one," she replied, and the confidence in her voice did not come from the role she was playing, but from the clarity she had found within it. Later, as the night reached its peak and the room filled with the kind of energy that came from decisions being made and perceptions being formed, Ethan stepped slightly closer to her, his voice low, almost lost in the surrounding noise. "You are changing it," he said, and Ava glanced at him, a small, steady smile forming. "No," she replied. "We are." And the correction was subtle, but it mattered, because this was no longer just his world or her place within it. It was something they were shaping together. And as the cameras captured their presence once more, as conversations shifted and narratives adjusted in real time, Ava realized that this was not about proving anything anymore. It was about establishing something new, something that did not fit into the expectations that had been set before. And as she stood there, unwavering, certain in a way she had not been before, she understood that the story being written about her was no longer one she had to accept. It was one she could define. "This was never part of the deal," Ava said softly, her voice steady even as the music faded into the background and the last round of applause from the gala stage settled into silence. Because in that moment, standing beneath the warm lights with every eye still lingering on them, she realized that something had shifted beyond anything written in ink or agreed upon in private. Ethan turned slightly toward her, his expression unreadable at first, but there was a quiet tension beneath it. Something that mirrored the realization forming between them. "No," he admitted, his voice low, honest in a way it had not been at the beginning. It was not. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the weight of everything they had built over the past days settling into something real, something undeniable. The room around them continued to move, conversations resuming, people adjusting to the new narrative that had taken shape. But for Ava, it felt like everything had narrowed to this single moment, this quiet space where the truth could no longer be avoided. 30 days, she continued, almost as if reminding herself. "That is what we agreed on." And Ethan nodded once, but the gesture felt different now, less like confirmation and more like acknowledgement of something that no longer held the same meaning. "And what happens when they are over?" he asked, and the question was simple, but it carried a depth that neither of them had addressed until now, because before, the end had been clear, an exit, a return to separate lives. But now, standing here after everything they had faced, everything they had chosen, that clarity had faded. Ava looked at him, really looked this time, not at the role he played, not at the power he held, but at the man who had stepped into uncertainty alongside her. And for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that this was not just an arrangement, not just a temporary solution, but something that had grown quietly, steadily, into something real. "I do not know," she admitted, and there was no fear in her voice now, only honesty, and Ethan exhaled slowly, as if the answer, uncertain as it was enough. The moment was interrupted by the approach of his mother, her presence as composed and deliberate as ever. But there was something different in her expression now, something less guarded, more thoughtful, as if she too had been watching, assessing, and perhaps reconsidering. "You have made your position very clear," she said, addressing Ethan. But her gaze shifted to Ava almost immediately, and Ava held it, steady, unflinching, because she no longer felt the need to prove anything, not in the same way she had before. "And you," his mother continued, her tone measured but not unkind, "have shown more resilience than most would expect." And Ava inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the words without overstepping their meaning, because she understood that this was not approval, not fully, but it was not rejection either, and that mattered. "This will not be simple," his mother added, her voice softer now, but perhaps simplicity was never the point. And with that, she stepped back, leaving them once again in a space that felt entirely their own, despite the crowd around them. Ethan glanced at Ava, a quiet question in his eyes, one that did not need to be spoken, and Ava felt it, the shift, the moment where choice replaced circumstance, where what happened next would not be dictated by a contract or a plan, but by what they were willing to risk. She took a slow breath, grounding herself, remembering everything she had learned, everything she had faced, and then she reached into her small evening clutch, pulling out the folded contract she had kept with her, not as a reminder of obligation, but as a marker of where this had started. She looked at it for a moment, the clean lines, the clear terms, the certainty it had once represented, and then, without hesitation, she handed it to Ethan. He looked down at it, then back at her, understanding dawning in his expression. "Ava," he began, but she shook her head slightly, a small but decisive gesture. "This was never about the contract," she said, her voice calm, certain. "And it is not what is keeping me here." And the truth of it settled between them, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but solid, undeniable. Ethan held her gaze for a long moment, and then, slowly, he folded the paper once more, not as something to preserve, but as something to set aside, and placed it back into her hand. "Then we decide what comes next," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice now, no distance, only a quiet certainty that matched her own. Ava closed her fingers around the paper, feeling its weight one last time before slipping it back into her clutch, not as a contract anymore, but as a memory. And as she looked up at him, the noise of the room fading once more into the background, she realized that whatever came next would not be defined by where she had started or how others saw her. It would be defined by the choices they made from this moment forward. And for the first time, that did not feel uncertain, it felt possible.